Hello, everyone. We are delighted that you have joined us for another USC US China Institute webcast. I'm Clayton Doobie. I have the good fortune to work for the US China Institute, and we are delighted to have with us today Professor Tom Narins, coming to us from the University of Albany. And he is going to be talking about a really important subject, a topic that people all around the world are focused on: China's Belt and Road Initiative. What does it mean? What does it mean for China? What does it mean for the world? And he'll be looking at questions of sovereignty and these other questions. You'll be able to raise questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you just scroll down on the Zoom screen to the Q&A, you can click on that, and at any time during the presentation, please just type in your question, and it'll be my pleasure to bring your question to Tom at the conclusion of his presentation. So today we're going for 90 minutes, and we'll have a chance to hear from him and then to hear from you. So please, at any time, go ahead and type in your question. The program will also be available via Facebook Live. And so those who would rather stream it there and participate that way are welcome to do that as well. Professor Narins comes to us with a wealth of experience. He's worked in the private sector, but also now for several years teaching at Albany. His research has focused on China's investments and China's engagement with the world, particularly in Latin America and in Africa. Very few people have worked in both locations, but Professor Narins has. And we're extremely fortunate to have him with us today. He's recently published about the lure of Chinese state capitalism for Latin America, and he's been working, as I say, in this region for quite some time. So first, we'll open with his presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for your questions. But before we do that, let me just say hi, Tom, and welcome him and his family to the webcast. Ladies and gentlemen, your presentation.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webcast and for your interest in the notions of sovereignty and the Belt Road Initiative. Before I begin my talk, I would like to thank Carol Weiss, professor in the International Relations School at USC, and Clayton Doob from the USC US China Institute for their very kind invitation to participate in this year's speaker series on China. As a political and economic geographer, my research and fieldwork focuses on Chinese trade, investment, and loan making beyond China's borders, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. So in my talk today, while I will be discussing China's relationship to sovereignty in terms of the Belt Road Initiative, if any of you have any questions regarding Chinese-Latin American relations, I'd be happy to entertain questions at the end of this talk. So let's get started. Today I would like to speak with you about sovereignty regimes and the Belt Road Initiative. Historical and conventional international relations frameworks describe the Belt Road Initiative as representing a newly ambitious Chinese drive into global politics that positions China as moving away from its longtime reticence towards foreign entanglements. So this raises a contradiction of China being at one and the same time both a defender of its own territorial sovereignty, while also being engaged in various projects, particularly the BRI and the closely associated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that point in completely different directions. This project seeks to build upon and move beyond conventional framings to understand how the BRI represents a conflict over the workings of state sovereignty that such frameworks have trouble addressing. This project argues that the absence of a singular, official Chinese government Belt Road Initiative map promotes a quote-unquote useful fuzziness with regards to China being open to crafting a new, as of yet undefined geopolitical identity. In light of the absence of an official BRI map, it is worth considering key ideas relating to China's geopolitical expansion via the BRI in terms of so-called sovereignty regimes. This is a term and a phrase that political geographer John Agnew coined in 2005 to describe the various practices of authority and control emanating originally from states that take on different geographical shapes. Conflicts arise when a state, such as China, finds itself caught between the operational imperatives of multiple sovereignty regimes or multiple ways of organizing sovereignty geographically. In other words, the likelihood for geopolitical tensions arising with the growth and geographic expansion of the BRI involves Chinese historical familiarity with and preference for classic sovereignty, a sovereignty where the territory of a country or a state is consolidated by a strong central government. This clashes with the reality of being open to other BRI partner countries' legal frameworks, norms, and institutions. Such a reality of being connected to other countries through economic and political partnerships is a necessity when thinking about a global type framework. Also, at the time when Chinese President Xi Jinping is keen on creating new governance norms rather than following old ones, and he seeks to do so on a global rather than on a domestic scale, I agree with Elizabeth Economy's observation that one of the great paradoxes of China today involves Xi Jinping's effort to position himself as a champion of globalization on the one hand, while at the same time restricting the free flow of capital, information, and goods between China and the rest of the world on the other hand. By identifying current sovereignty regime dynamics raised by the BRI in light of the relevant yet distinctive historical experience of the Marshall Plan, this work can be used as a model for understanding how China's current leadership is managing the debate of simultaneously protecting strong borders, yet also promoting a policy of going out that is engaging politically and economically with other countries. The absence of a singular official Chinese government map of the BRI may be an intentional move on the part of leadership in Beijing to open the future relationship between China and countries and localities associated with BRI projects, and preventing the bordering of a newly emerging regime such as the BRI, whose ultimate shape is still very much unknown, can help to minimize cartographic anxieties, a term that scholars have used to describe the geopolitical tensions that arise with the printing of maps. The Chinese government's ongoing publication and reproduction of the 9-dash line in the South China Sea is an ongoing geopolitical controversy that Chinese leaders most likely do not wish to relive with the emergent BRI. So given the current unbordered framework of the BRI, here I use the concept of sovereignty regimes as a way of analyzing 4 possible governance frameworks that the nascent BRI may eventually adopt. That the BRI is not a single plan at all, and that the official BRI website, shown here, lacks a detailed explanation of the plan's goals, further contributes to this initiative's undefined nature. In fact, one of the key misunderstandings of the BRI relates to the conceptualization of the project as comprising a well-defined, fixed, and predetermined set of maritime and land routes and transects, as many cartographic images depict. The reality, however, points toward an ambiguity surrounding the future of Chinese sovereignty, namely the shape of Chinese power. Many maps appear in articles about the BRI, but they are not based on empirical data. They just convey directional gestures associated with the Silk Road language, anchored in a few nodes. And this is an example of what geographers call misplaced geographical concreteness. And this really implies that more is known about the initiative as a whole and what it has achieved so far than is actually in fact the case. The BRI cannot, at this stage, be accurately and verifiably mapped because what it currently represents geopolitically is still very much unknown. So, employing the notion of sovereignty regimes, which are geographic representations of political power, is one way of exploring the geopolitical possibilities of the still nascent set of Chinese government-inspired infrastructural and institutional frameworks that make up the BRI. Sovereignty regimes then constitute a framework for explaining the principal ways in which sovereignty, defined as the authority of a state that it has to govern itself or other states, is currently practiced. Sovereignty regimes account for the comparative strength of centralized state authority and the degree to which such authority is consolidated in the territory of a state. The four idealized types of sovereignty regimes here are classic, imperialist, integrative, and globalist. While matching China to one of these four idealized types of sovereignty regimes, shown on this table, is not the aim of this project, such a framework is meant to highlight the different shapes sovereignty can take given the uncertain trajectory of China's handling of sovereignty. Addressing the still evolving BRI through the sovereignty regimes framework helps us to chart out four possible directions the Chinese state may take as the Chinese Communist Party attempts to navigate the fine line of altering a global system it views as overly Western, while simultaneously trying to appease claims of Chinese neo-imperialism. Now, let's walk through these four sovereignty regime types. Let's start off with the classic regime. The classic regime is similar to the doctrine of mercantilism in its totalizing of territorial borders and its emphasis on central state regulation of all transactions entering and leaving a state's home territory. Up until the early 2000s, when China joined the World Trade Organization and when it began being thought of in terms of being a responsible stakeholder in global politics, and when it saw its geo-economic interests following connections beyond China's borders, up until this time, China embodied the classical sovereignty regime with power over society and power through society still largely deployed within its bounded state territory. Next, the imperialist regime can be viewed as the opposite of the classic sovereignty regime, in that it emphasizes hierarchy in world politics, but with a networked reach over space. And this organizational setup increasingly supplements or replaces direct territorial control. So this regime type questions state authority and questions central state authority as it relies on the cooperation of local elites in other countries. Regions such as Latin America, which have had a historically dependent political economic status with the global north, exemplify this imperialist sovereignty regime. The third regime, integrative, highlights the overlapping nature of sovereignty relating to the coexistence between different levels or tiers of government through different national, subnational, and local scales. This regime type is best exemplified by the European Union. The integrative regime represents an at times politically unclassifiable entity that challenges traditional or classic state sovereignty in functionality, complex and oftentimes non-territorial ways. The final regime, the globalist regime, can be understood as effective sovereignty exercised by a geopolitical hegemon within and beyond its nominal national boundaries through international institutions within which it is particularly influential. And this regime, the globalist regime, is exemplified by the United States since the end of World War II and by Britain in the 1800s. The globalist sovereignty regime attempts to enroll other states into a hegemon's governing authority through free-willed participation. This regime is noteworthy because it envisions and encapsulates the idea that sovereignty is borderless, in other words, global. Interpreting these four regimes highlights the sovereignty challenges and contradictions presented by the growth and expansion of the BRI. So how does the Belt and Road Initiative fit into these four sovereignty regime types? I argue that the forces driving the BRI involve realizing the Chinese dream, improving China's international economic connectivity, and enhancing China's global infrastructural investment and trade. And these three forces combine and reflect on three factors that highlight and remind us of a possible way that the BRI could follow and develop into in the future. These factors include China's desire to regain its historical centrality in world affairs. This concept follows the imperialist sovereignty regime. China's quest to address its humiliation by prior foreign invasion. This concept addresses the classic sovereignty regime. And China's aspirational determination to address its current state of being surrounded by US allies in Asia by attempting to enroll other states via the BRI infrastructural and AIIB financial institutions. And this last point represents the globalist regime. So using this sovereignty regime's framework directly addresses the geopolitical contradictions that the Chinese government faces, and I seek to build on William Callahan's call to view the type of connectivity represented by the BRI as, quote, more than an issue of the hardware of physical infrastructure, but rather it is also a software issue of the connectivity of ideas, institutions, and behavior in diplomacy itself, end quote. Considering the BRI framework in terms of sovereignty regimes is especially timely. The BRI's expansion beyond East Asia has sprouted important debates that are shaping geopolitics today. Political debates relating to Chinese leadership's position towards sovereign maritime claims and the fear of financial indebtedness on the part of countries receiving Chinese financing are all shaping the way in which Chinese interests are viewed geopolitically. The current US administration is helping to roll back its own global influence, and this equates to leaving the field open for China to shape and expand the BRI. I argue that the BRI is a political economic encapsulation of China's leadership's desire to manage these tensions by promoting a new geopolitical identity for itself, a new aspirational globalist sovereignty regime identity. But is such an arrangement even possible or sustainable? Perhaps because of the absence of an official map delimiting the BRI as a Eurasian or Africa-only political economic project, Rhetoric surrounding this initiative has already adopted a borderless and expansionist flavor to include a Pacific Silk Road, a Silk Road on ice that crosses the Arctic Ocean, and a digital Silk Road through cyberspace. The globalist sovereignty regime places emphasis on the lack of borders and on the willing enrollment of participants into a hegemon's global vision. Key terms such as belt and road are intended to connect large swaths of territory and may serve to encourage BRI participant countries to coordinate their activities in a borderless fashion. To this end, the BRI has been variously referred to as a, quote, geofunctionalist institutionalist project and a, quote, alternative idea showing how the common space of international politics could be organized in the future, and as a, quote, possibly unique opportunity to reassert itself as the center of regional, if not world affairs, and, quote, the means to the much larger end of promoting China's new vision of global governance, end quote. One of the challenges surrounding the development of the BRI as a globalist sovereignty regime that would be attractive to Chinese neighbors is trying to convince partnering countries that this initiative is in fact globalist in nature, as has been stated explicitly by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2017. The goal then is to foster regional cooperation, which involves the building of consensus through rules and participation, and is really the hallmark of the globalist sovereignty regime. However, as this slide shows, long-standing historical anxieties that exist in societies near or neighboring China help to underscore the challenges that proponents of the BRI as a quote-unquote globalist sovereignty regime face. In Mongolia, for example, anxieties about China's economic influence go beyond recent and contemporary political economic issues and are tied to memories of the Qing dynasty. Such historical concerns contribute to modern-day worries over declining sovereignty, triggered by Chinese and other actors' participation in Mongolia's mining sector, and pose a significant roadblock towards the BRI evolving into a globalist sovereignty regime. In Nepal, while Chinese infrastructure projects do play a key role in helping the Nepali government solidify its authority and enhance its national security, the major new infrastructure projects are promised as the long-awaited vehicles that will finally deliver wealth and modernization across Nepal, and yet similar promises have been made and have been left unfulfilled for decades. So this history of unattained development in Nepal promises and deserves consideration and warrants pause among those who advocate that the BRI will develop into a globalist regime structure. Other examples of Chinese commercial activity beyond China's borders serve to question the overarching power of China's ability to enroll and entice people to accept and participate in BRI institutions. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, it is oftentimes the flexible entrepreneurial strategies of individual Chinese people and not the Chinese state that play an important and significant role in Chinese-Kyrgyzstani cross-border trade dynamics. Finally, in Myanmar, nationalistic movements suggest that the BRI plan has a complex array of social and political hurdles that need to be addressed if this initiative is to find acceptance in China's near-abroad regions. So for all of those reasons, it is still unclear if the BRI can or will evolve into a globalist sovereignty regime. Although less likely, the possibility of the BRI becoming an integrative sovereignty regime deserves some consideration. This regime allows for the coexistence between different levels of government, and such a framework could range from BRI-wide to Chinese national to subnational or regional political organizations. While it is true that China is currently governed by an assemblage of political actors, The increasing consolidation of power by Xi Jinping himself suggests that this framework, this integrative sovereignty regime framework, may not align with the policy goals and national visions of China's current leadership. Now let's consider the BRI in relation to the classic sovereignty regime. First off, however, there is an inherent paradox and difficulty in developing the BRI into a globalist sovereignty regime, given Chinese leadership's track record of deploying a classic sovereignty regime. Classic sovereignty regime is one in which political power is territorially bounded by the borders of a state. Classic sovereignty, then, is the regime most often invoked when depicting traditional state sovereignty. It is a regime that depends on a high degree of centralized government political authority, and it is easily understood since this regime, power and control are limited to the geographic boundaries of a state. Two geopolitically turbulent examples highlight Beijing's preoccupation with this classic sovereignty regime type. First, the July 2016 ruling in favor of the Philippines by the International Arbitral Tribunal in the South China Sea case highlights the deep concern about maintaining and reclaiming national territory while seeking to be a responsible geopolitical stakeholder. By viewing itself as the rightful sovereign authority over the South China Sea, China's leadership is signaling its ongoing preoccupation with traditional concepts of control over state territory. And second, China's humiliation at the hands of foreigners from the 1840s to the 1940s, specifically the carving up of China's territory by European and other powers, is a central part of the official history that is taught in Chinese school. This humiliation serves as a reminder of the subservience that follows from a failure to respond adequately to foreign threats and to defend China's borders against colonial dismemberment. Beginning in the late 1940s, Mao Zedong restored Chinese national sovereignty from foreign colonial powers by unifying the country, a clear move in the direction of the classic sovereignty regime. So these two examples, highlighted and depicted visually on this slide, together with the growth of the Chinese economy since the late 1970s, has strengthened China's geopolitical presence as a state in support of the classic state sovereignty regime. Leadership in Beijing may also be shaping its new political vision around principles aligned with an imperialist sovereignty regime. Unlike the globalist and classic sovereignty regimes, the imperialist variety relies on a neo-tributary framework, which involves the Chinese historic tributary tradition as a means of shaping China's contemporary global power strategy. The Mandarin saying, everything under heavens, 天下, highlights China's historical worldview and China's experience with infrastructural connectivity is offered to weaker neighbors as both a form of assistance and as a form of power, showing China's power. The neo-tributary perspective identifies China's exceptionalism, trade and diplomacy linkages, and image building as a way of acknowledging the needs and aspirations of China's contemporary diplomacy from a non-Western Chinese perspective. The contemporary relevance of the neo-tributary perspective, that is this imperialist perspective, as an aid in situating China's place in the world, aligns well with China's traditional view of itself as a cultural core expanding outward. Deeply embedded in the imperialist sovereignty regime is a belief in and an adherence to soft power on the part of Chinese leadership. Chinese leadership views soft power in ways that are different from Western views of soft power. Chinese views of soft power encompass not only popular culture and public diplomacy, but also more coercive economic and diplomatic levers like aid and investment and participation in multilateral organizations. Furthermore, China's fixation on its cultural and not only its political and military strength further lends credence to the validity of the tribute system or tributary system as the best way to ensure that it is able to maintain national face and a sense of overall superiority. Taken together then, these factors suggest that designing and maintaining the BRI as an imperialist sovereignty regime will be more likely than its institutionalization as a globalist sovereignty regime. This regime classification aligns well with China's psychological worldview of interactions between states being best understood as relational and bilateral. Recent activity of Chinese state-owned enterprises with regards to European and Eurasian infrastructure and infrastructural projects in Eurasia further support the BRI as aligning with the imperialist more than the globalist sovereignty regime. Characterized by networked reach over space, as well as direct territorial control, this imperialist sovereignty regime entails the deployment of sovereignty as necessarily tied to the dependent political economic status that many states endure. In 2017, for instance, the Sri Lankan government, having taken on $1.5 billion of Chinese debt for the construction of a seaport at the town of Hambantota, decided to grant control of the port to Beijing. The 70% controlling interest that China now has of the port for the next 99 years has been described as a, quote, strategic move to advance China's BRI goals, something the Chinese firm at the center of the deal has been explicit about, end quote. This deal has raised concerns about the eventual arrival of Chinese naval vessels, a move that would support the use of the imperialist sovereignty regime to characterize the BRI. Of the three sovereignty regimes challenging the globalist regime as a potential explanatory concept for the emergent BRI, this imperialist sovereignty regime represents a direct challenge to Chinese leadership's ability to manage the political and economic tensions associated with the Chinese state promoting a new, borderless geopolitical identity for itself. In the case of the Marshall Plan, most post-World War II Western European countries were eager to cooperate with the US government because US grants were given in a political atmosphere of post-war governmental as much as infrastructural rebuilding. The following and the next few slides will compare and contrast the US Marshall Plan with the Chinese BRI in an attempt to clarify the overarching geopolitical uncertainty associated with the latter. Broad political economic comparisons of the Marshall Plan and the BRI have placed emphasis on both plans being put forward at times when the world system was not functioning properly. Both initiatives must be understood as entailing a mix of economic and geopolitical objectives, which together can be seen as a proactive responses by strong state actors to major sea changes in the geopolitical landscape at the time of their formation. The Marshall Plan was the prototype of the globalist sovereignty regime after the Second World War, and its emphasis on governance more than just on infrastructure has helped to consolidate the staying power of this Western-led world order, to this day. Although seeking a different pathway, I argue that the evolution of the BRI is happening in a geopolitical system that has been indelibly shaped by the Marshall Plan. Whereas the key geopolitical driver Forging the creation of the Marshall Plan was the rebuilding of a shattered Europe following World War II in an effort to thwart Europe from falling under Soviet domination. At the broadest levels, these factors serve as a reminder of the contested nature of Chinese sovereignty, especially in an era where economic clout is enabling China to question the dominant world order as crafted by the American and European governments that has been in place since 1944. Comparing the Marshall Plan and the BRI highlights the way in which contemporary geopolitics is shifting away from a US or European-based international regulatory framework towards a more Chinese-influenced world order, as this slide highlights. Such a comparison also serves to highlight the importance of sovereignty regimes in a dynamic geopolitical system that often bends to those state actors who have a monopoly on power and a monopoly on power through society. While it is clear that the Marshall Plan represented the globalist sovereignty regime, I argue that it is still too early to tell, and there are too many complexities to determine which type of sovereignty regime the Belt Road Initiative will most closely mimic. Although the Chinese government does not favor the comparison between these two initiatives, since it views the Marshall Plan as a contributing factor in the containment of the Soviet Union, even though the US did not initially set out to do this, the main geopolitical motives of each plan have and will continue to have global implications. And so the framing ideas found in both of these initiatives include open membership to all interested and willing parties, the global use and adoption of American and Chinese products and ideas respectively, and a strong and clear emphasis on multilateralism. The way that the BRI is articulated by the Chinese government is a system of mutual benefit for all of its participant countries and for the entire world. There are challenges, however, to the BRI being willingly accepted by diverse groups of people and by diverse groups of actors. The problem with this projection of the BRI is that the way the Chinese Communist Party has treated other groups that do not follow the Chinese government's directives, ranging from Chinese political dissidents such as Liu Xiaobo and Hu Jia, to countries on the South China Sea such as Vietnam, who have overlapping claims to islands and waters in the region, has not been conducive and has not been conducted with utmost benevolence toward the quote-unquote other. In addition to the growing US-Chinese geopolitical rivalry, in which regulators increasingly seek to investigate and discredit BRI-related financing, the rise in importance of Chinese state-owned enterprises, SOEs, as the vehicles through which Xi Jinping is promoting Chinese self-reliance, only serves to complicate notions that the BRI represents China's international development strategy, namely globalization 2.0. Xi's recent use of the term self-reliance in relation to the larger role SOEs will play in guiding the Chinese economy suggests a fuzziness which, similar to the lack of an official BRI map, may be a way to buy time to strategize the best approach to take for the still evolving cohort of BRI projects. The original Maoist idea of self-reliance emphasized isolation from exploitative capitalist and Western forces, while Deng Xiaoping and others used the term to promote greater integration in the world economy. The recent CCP decision to insert the Communist Party into the bylaws of China's largest corporations represents another factor challenging the view of the BRI as a potentially globalist enterprise. This decision is likely to increasingly bring Chinese non-state actors under the canopy of the Chinese government's umbrella of power. Perhaps not surprisingly, the development and deployment of investment and infrastructural connectivity programs into BRI-affiliated states is characterized by contradictions. Such contradictions further complicate the sovereignty regime designation of China's BRI. And although Western biases may suggest that Chinese state-owned enterprises are more likely to seek out investment locations in other authoritarian regimes, recent scholarship doesn't support such a claim. China's national oil companies, for example, seek out investment locations that have fewer regulatory hurdles and a track record of long-term stability. A key factor enabling China's national oil companies to take such actions involves the CCP's willingness to shift the locus of risk away from Beijing and squarely into the firm itself. And while such a stance contradicts insertions of the CCP into China's largest firms, this also suggests that pathways other than a full-fledged imperialist sovereignty regime are a possibility for Chinese government-affiliated actors moving forward. This contradiction raises the question, how can Beijing allow a loosening of control for Chinese firms beyond China's borders and still maintain a high degree of economic and political authority over such firms and actors along the lines of classic sovereignty within China's territorial boundaries? Likewise, recent deaths of Chinese workers in Pakistan highlight the conflicts at play over the workings of notions of classical versus globalist state sovereignty in relationship to the BRI. On the one hand, China's contemporary political economic advance is centered around building Chinese classic sovereignty, strength, power, and influence. But on the other hand, Chinese sources have readily admitted to the reality that the BRI projects in Pakistan will bring the deaths of many Chinese workers here as a part of China's push to create a new geopolitical identity. In short, the limits to China's shaping the BRI into an alternative globalist regime appear to be numerous and mounting. So in conclusion, this project asks the question, how can China as a modern state defend its borders as its main priority, yet also support a growing role for itself and other Chinese actors in the world at large? The answer to this question involves simultaneously leveraging China's strengths and experiences in government-to-government deal-making, entrepreneurial flexibility, learning, adaptation and innovativeness, infrastructural construction, and project finance to enroll other states and other actors into the still evolving Belt Road Initiative. That these projects and pathways have not been enshrined in a singular official cartographic statement first points to a continued expansion of the BRI, and second may serve to lessen antagonism toward China by already wary neighbors and far-off rivals. Such an open, still undefined cartography represents the CCP's attempt to encourage what it hopes will be a globalist regime that will evolve and develop naturally and organically without any predetermined political borders, boundaries, or limits. As discussed here today, such hopes are complicated by an array of sovereignty-related factors. That there is no one official Chinese government BRI map is suggestive of the rhetorical role of the BRI. Only when precise delimitation becomes possible will we be able to see whether this is a new globalist, imperialist, or integrated project. In any of these cases, the first sign would have to be a clear abandonment of the classic sovereignty regime that China seems intent on furthering. So this concludes my presentation for today, and I would like to thank everyone for tuning in, and I would be happy to address any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you.
And Tom, thank you. Thank you for a terrific presentation. Very methodically presented. Before we get your camera up and you on the screen, I wanted to take a moment and thank Carol Wise, who you mentioned. Carol Wise, professor of international relations here at USC, helped to make this possible, plus the staff at the US-China Institute, Craig Stubing, Venus Jones, and Catherine Gao. We're delighted to have more than 100 people participating in this discussion. And Tom, if I might, I'd like to begin partly where you left off. You highlighted at the very beginning of your presentation, and then again at the end, that there's a lot of ambiguity about BRI. And so one of the people participating, Mary Kay Magstad, a longtime journalist, she said, how many countries are we talking about? And of course, there is an official tally of people who have signed on and things like that. But as you say, there's no map. And I wanted to unravel that a little bit, if I could. So the first focus is, isn't ambiguity the norm on big economic projects in China? And if you think back to 1978, China didn't have a carefully mapped out plan that would ultimately lead to state-owned enterprises being available for purchase on stock exchanges and things like that. You didn't have that. And not having all the answers when you start may mean that you can adapt flexibly, that you can be pragmatic, that conditions will guide the pace of change and the scale of change. Is that what's going on here? Because at the same time, we know that China has a state economic plan, and it has a Made in China 2025 initiative with very specific targets about this percentage and these sorts of things. What is your thought about this ambiguity? Is it strategic? Is it working? Or does it lead to other questions?
Well, I would agree with you. I think the ambiguity is something that leaders in Beijing want to have because they don't want to limit the success of the BRI. I think those of us who have been studying the BRI and have been following it know that this is not a preconceived fixed plan. This is something that's been developing. And in fact, Chinese leaders were surprised at how successful and how many countries were interested in joining the BRI. So I think ambiguity is something that is working in China's favor, especially, and as I mentioned, how the backlash that China has experienced from dealing with the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. So that is a cartographic statement which has not only countries in that region mad and upset and concerned about their own future, but other countries like the United States who care about the international waters and the right to pass through international waters. Other countries care about that as well. So by not having a cartographic statement, not having a official visual, I think China can continue to explore its sovereignty options moving forward and enroll other participant countries to work willingly with China for the purposes of, as China says, win-win mutual benefit.
Yeah, one of the striking things, as you said, is without a map, and even the notion about an economic corridor and those kinds of things, that has all gone by the wayside. Latin America is part of BRI. Both sides of the continent are part of BRI. And so it has allowed for essentially any sort of external economic arrangement to be rolled in. And at the same time, it also satisfies the needs of various jurisdictions in China and corporations, which are supposed to be doing BRI things. And so let me include Ecuador, let me include Peru, let me include Brazil to do that. Do you think that that's part of it? Is, it's just this catch-all?
Well, part of the Chinese worldview, as we know, is China's position as a central player in the world. And in fact, what we've been seeing in Latin America and specifically in South America is countries that are approaching China, asking to join and be part of the BRI. So it's more of a outward request on the part of others to join China, rather than China pushing and forcing and coercing smaller actors to necessarily sign on. So we see, especially in Latin America, that has a history of non-success, if you will, with working with the United States for internal development, looking at China as just another alternative, not necessarily saying that China has all the answers, but as an alternative to the US neoliberal model, is something that is attractive to countries which have not succeeded as much as they've wanted to, both politically and economically in Latin America.
Yeah, it's a way for China to bring these folks in, but a way to somehow organize this sort of thing. Peru wants to have a relationship. Ecuador, these countries, they want to have a relationship, and let's call it this. Let's organize it in this way. Tom, you said some things about kind of domestic drivers for the Belt and Road Initiative, and I wish you would say just a little bit more on that subject. The kind of domestic imperatives. There's a demographic imperative. There's an economic imperative. There's a domestic political imperative for BRI. And I was hoping you might say something about that, how in addition to strengthening ties with foreign countries, it's a way to more fully integrate parts of China.
Well, absolutely. I think that we know that one of the reasons that Chinese companies, some are private, some are state-owned, have sought overseas connections is because of the need to find new markets, to find places for Chinese products to be sold, because as we know, the Chinese market is so competitive, so well developed compared to other neighboring countries. And so this is something that also drives the BRI. And this is not only at the state level. We see individual Chinese entrepreneurs opening businesses in Africa, partly because of the competition within China is so fierce. Moving to Africa is one way to develop a business, and also to practice English for people whose native language is not English. And oftentimes successful individual Chinese entrepreneurs who set up shop in an African country, after a few years, they develop business competency, but also practice their English. And if their business does well enough, they may be able to move to places like England or the United States. So these are stepping stones, not these movements away from China into other parts of the world, are ways for domestic actors to improve their lives by leaving the boundaries, the borders of China.
And also, by focusing not so much on the connection to Latin America, but on Southeast Asia and Central Asia, you're dealing with border regions that might be more fully brought aboard. I was wondering, I only have a couple more questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. And the audience has been contributing all sorts of questions, 50 by my most recent count. And so we'll get to those. If you want to raise a question, please go to the bottom of the screen, click on that Q&A button and type in your query. We probably won't get to everything, but we'll try to group them in a way that's useful. Now, you mentioned that there's no Belt and Road organization. We have these forums where people offer prepared speeches and mingle informally and do those sorts of things. Had a couple of those thus far, but there's no organization. The main organization that exists is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And that kind of component, plus you've got policy banks and things like that. And this goes to the China's approach to foreign affairs question. The extent to which it's ready to embrace multilateralism as opposed to bilateral. And you used the term globalist, right? And these sorts of things. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that. How much of this is just within China's comfort zone? How much of this is strategic? What do you think?
I think China has succeeded in a Western designed world since 1944 at the end of World War II. It's really the United States and Britain who've crafted this world that we live in, which is the Marshall Plan is one of the results of that, and also how we function as a world economy. So China has succeeded in this world and has really benefited from that. But at the same time, China wants to, with this growing economic clout, it wants to craft a world where it has more of a say in writing the international rules. So I think China is definitely, so far, has used its clout to comfortably engage in bilateral relations. We know that China is very known for engaging in bilateral relations, but at the same time, we see China crafting and leading not only the BRI, but also this Asian Infrastructural Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other organizations where China is playing a role, contributing. And China realizes that this is we live in a multilateral framework. There are other countries that are also rising. It's not only China. And so China is very keen on inserting its ideas, but in a multilateral framework. So this is something that it's not either or, it's really both and.
Okay. That's one of the things that Xi Jinping in his various addresses has emphasized, right? Inclusivity, arguing that China is always going to be tied to developing nations, even as it moves into the ranks of the developed world, that sort of thing. And so pushing that. Now, if you could, and this will be my last question for the moment, what would the consequence of China adopting ultimately some sort of neo-tributary imperialist regime on this? What would the benefits be? What would the costs be? Even though that might be a very comfortable place, you know, given Chinese history, but what would the costs be?
I think one of the immediate costs would be current other geopolitical actors that have strengths, such as the United States and countries in the European Union. They would react to that. They would feel uncomfortable with this neo-tributary power acting as a imperialist regime. And so there would be conflict, I think. Not necessarily immediately armed conflict, but there would be certainly diplomatic conflict. And I think this is one of the reasons why China is trying to feel out other options apart from the imperialist option. Historically, of course, China has viewed itself as a central role in the world. And certainly, China is not only the mother culture in East Asia, but is by far and away the strongest and largest economy in East Asia. So economic clout, not only in East Asia, but in anywhere in the world, kind of comes along with and is attached to geopolitical stature.
Thank you, Tom. We have quite a few questions. Let me try and group them together. And some of them have come from colleagues here in Southern California, and others are coming from all over the world. So one question is that was raised had to do with Southeast Asia and ASEAN. So talking about a international organization, multilateral organization, that China, participates in as an observer, that sort of thing. Can you say something about how the Belt and Road Initiative fits within the strategies of these kinds of organizations and the countries that are working with China on this?
Well, certainly. ASEAN, as we know, is focused on Southeast Asia. Of course, China does have an observer role there, but one of the deficiencies from the point of China is that China does not play a central role in ASEAN, and Southeast Asia is a part of Asia, part of the greater Eurasian landmass. It doesn't include the largest country in Asia, being Russia. It doesn't include Western Eurasia, namely Europe. So ASEAN has never been a vehicle that China could enter and expand to include all of Asia. So it's been limiting. Of course, it benefits countries in Southeast Asia, but China has had a larger view. In fact, initially, the BRI started as a political and economic framework to connect Eurasian countries, Asia and Europe, and African countries. Of course, as we know, it's gone global, it's expanded. But the ASEAN as a multilateral organization has been perhaps a learning and training ground for China to understand what multilateralism might look like in Asia, but it hasn't been encompassing enough for China's global vision of the BRI.
Now, if we look, for example, at a part of China, a key part of China. Several people have raised the question about Hong Kong and how Hong Kong fits. Some years ago, in fact, Hong Kong was playing a key role. The Hong Kong Trade Development Council here in Southern California brought together its offices from all over Latin America and introduced them to the Belt and Road Initiative and the special services that Hong Kong could provide. And one of the questions that has been raised is, where is Hong Kong in this now? Is Hong Kong now second to Shenzhen as China develops its Greater Bay Initiative and that sort of thing? What is the potential role for a place like Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong has always played a very important part of China's connection to the global economy. It's after China, the PRC opened up in 1978, it was Hong Kong-based investors who accounted for the majority of foreign direct investment into mainland China. So Hong Kong has and continues to play a key role in developing BRI aspirations for Chinese companies who are seeking capital, looking to invest in Africa or in Europe or in Latin America. So it's the knowledge of Hong Kongers, citizens of Hong Kong, their business acumen, their familiarity with international law that is going to play a continued key role for Greater China as it seeks to expand and peacefully encourage and enroll other countries to join into the economic projects that make up the BRI.
Now, one of the things that you highlighted is that this is Xi Jinping's project. He's the one who initiates it in a couple of major speeches abroad and has hosted these forums in Beijing. And it's very much tied to the China dream. To realize the China dream, BRI has to be successful, has to help with that goal. Is it your sense that this ambition is widely shared by the Chinese leadership, or that this is too much tied to a single leader?
Thanks for addressing that. I'm glad we have time to address this question. Although it is true that it is definitely Xi Jinping's project, ideas relating to the BRI preceded and predated Xi Jinping. So leadership in Beijing has been interested in connecting the global economy, China to the global economy, ever since China opened up in the late 1970s. So I think that there is a wide understanding of China historically having a central role in the world. And so this is Xi Jinping's time as leader to make this happen. But it certainly is something that is beyond just Xi Jinping, although he is consolidating power to make this happen.
Yeah, he's definitely put a label out there. The going out strategy has been in place for a couple of decades now, and certainly predates Xi Jinping's leadership role. This role that Xi Jinping has played predates the arrival of Donald Trump on the international scene. To what extent is China benefiting from President Trump's America First rhetoric and actions, in not participating, not appointing new judges to the World Trade Organization, these kinds of things? So to what extent is China moving into a vacuum with BRI? The world needs development. The world needs infrastructure. And is China not just playing to a strength and seizing an opportunity?
I would say absolutely. China's strengths have always been government-to-government relations, providing loans to countries that don't have financing capabilities, especially to countries that have been viewed in the West as global pariahs, Argentina, some countries in Africa that have defaulted on previous World Bank loans. So China is very happy, I would imagine, with the leadership of Donald Trump in that he is stepping away. He's bringing the United States away from the global stage. And this is just making it easier for countries to choose to work with China, whereas in the past they may have chosen to work with Western governments such as the United States. But now there are fewer options, and China is willing, and as the common parlance in media, popular media goes, to provide help with fewer strings attached.
That's right. And that, of course, has been part of the doctrine, right? That you'll manage your internal affairs. We're coming in for this project. We're not going to tell you necessarily how to run the country. And that runs up against, the line that Hillary Clinton offered in Africa and the line that Mike Pompeo has offered in Africa, warning states that this is a debt trap, that this is yielding on sovereignty. What is your sense? Is the Sri Lankan case an aberration, or is it part of some master plan?
Well, I would say it's definitely not part of a master plan. I think especially after the Sri Lanka case, since the Sri Lankan case, we see countries that are smaller, that are in need of loans, being much more careful. And we see China, the public relations branch of the Chinese government, also being much more careful to describe what it is they're doing. What happened in Sri Lanka was really a contract that had to be fulfilled. So if we look at the details of what's happening with the port in Sri Lanka being reverted to Chinese power for 99 years, that was the consequence of a contract that that could not be fulfilled, and that was written ahead of time. So these debt trap scenarios, which we hear so much about in the media, are really not part of a master plan, I believe. They're really individual to specific actors. And I think now more than ever, we see in Malaysia, we see a pushback towards possible loans that could hurt the finances of the people of Malaysia and the government of Malaysia. So I think this is definitely not part of China's master plan.
Yeah, and we've seen pushback, in a lot of different places. In Africa, as you just highlighted, in Malaysia, Myanmar, a lot of places have pushed against certain aspects of this program. And not everybody in China is on board as well. And so there's pushback within China against BRI. Can you say something about that?
Sure. At a very basic level, China is a country which, as we know, still has hundreds of millions of poor people, of peasants, poor people who don't have access to basic job opportunities in healthcare. So one of the major gripes among a large section of Chinese citizenry is why fund and loan millions of renminbi to Myanmar when we here are in need of development and education and healthcare. So there is definitely a widespread discontent among many millions of Chinese people. They know that those are not necessarily the Chinese people who have a voice, who are in businesses that have overseas operations, but there is definitely discontent. And this is why we see thousands of protests every year in China trying to bring attention to the needs of ordinary Chinese citizens.
One of the striking things in BRI is that you've had state-owned companies go to build ports, build highways, build bridges, do all of these kinds of things, but you've also seen private entrepreneurs making the journey. And they may not be part of some sort of Belt and Road formal agenda, but they're definitely part of China's expanding investment, trade, and influence.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the idea of entrepreneurs benefiting from the BRI goes both ways. There was a recent article about GE, the American company GE, benefiting from BRI contracts. So American firms, especially those who are seeking to expand in Asia, are benefiting from the Chinese-led BRI. So it's not just Chinese firms. Oftentimes we do see pictures of Chinese workers with Chinese managers in places like Africa, building bridges, building roads. That is certainly true. But we also see other firms from Europe and the United States winning contracts to participate in the building of the BRI.
Now, your presentation today has been on the question of sovereignty, what the initiative means for Chinese ideas about sovereignty and how China interacts with the world. And I've been pestering you, and people in the Q&A section have been asking for very specific kinds of things. And that may be a little bit unfair, but let me ask more specifics, if I could. BRI is such a sprawling endeavor worldwide, right? And so many different industrial sectors, as well as service sectors, because people are talking about the telecommunications network that goes in and these kinds of services that are attached to it, this sort of thing. Are you able to make any kind of generalizations about what has been the norm? Has it been win-win? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's certainly too early to tell what the shape of the BRI will be in the future. But one thing that as academic geographers we all know is that we cannot generalize across space and across territory. And one of the reasons we can't do that is because territories, even though most countries in the world are less powerful than China, countries and their governments have unique political frameworks that apply to their territory that are not the same as other territories, as other countries. So the way that the BRI unfolds and unravels in Myanmar is necessarily and by default going to be different than the way it will unravel in India. And that's just because of life and in organizations and history and culture in those specific places. So it's hard to generalize, and I think it's that's why it's somewhat of a surprise to Chinese leadership how successful and how this term BRI has been carried off and really become so popular, not by pushing on the part of Chinese leadership, but really by pulling by the interest that other countries have in wanting to be part of the success of the Chinese dream, part of wanting to build on and use China to maybe follow that China's role in also becoming successful economically and politically.
And again, to bring this to what you were talking about with regard to sovereignty, if the adjudication of difficult spots, of disagreements, of differences, is always on a bilateral basis, does that mean that a globalist approach is just not possible? That as a practical matter, China is going to deal with these countries one by one based on the individual circumstances that you just highlighted?
Well, historically, it's been to China's favor, and China's felt more comfortable and has a familiarity with bilateral relations. So if we talk about the president of the Gambia going to Beijing to meet with President Xi Jinping, the Gambia is a country, of course, but it's much, much, much smaller than China. And so is that a fair comparison or a fair relationship between any type of economic agreement that would be between China's leaders and the leader of the Gambia? What political scientists and political geographers have argued is that for small countries in Latin America and in China and in Southeast Asia, why not work in a multilateral way, grouping Southeast Asian countries to negotiate with China, grouping African countries to go into negotiations with China, and grouping Latin American countries, so to build up a larger base of power and economic clout, and then negotiating with China. That may be a more helpful way forward for these smaller countries.
Yeah, as a practical matter, as Lester Ross mentions in the Q&A, there is no multilateral voice for BRI. There is an organization associated with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But the big financiers of this BRI initiative have been the policy banks, and and to a lesser extent, in-country financing, so from recipient nations. Now, we've seen countries encounter difficulty. Pakistan, one such case. You've already highlighted Sri Lanka, that sort of thing. With the international economic crisis that we're in, it's not just a health crisis, but an economic crisis, plunging commodity prices, these kinds of things. Is China overextended? Is this making China vulnerable, or is it in fact China's reaching out at exactly the moment that it most matters?
Well, I would argue the latter, Clay. I think that in terms of public relations, we've seen in terms of the actual COVID-19 virus, we've seen China appear in the news as a victim of the virus to being a public relations country where it's trying to help other countries deal with the virus. So this is very smart public relations. And as we know, China has historically and still today, leadership in Beijing, they take the long view. They take the long-term view. Quarterly reports from the stock exchange in New York City don't influence Chinese leadership because in the way that we know that how China operates. They have 5-year plans, there's looking at the long term. And this is why Chinese leaders in Beijing are willing to accept the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands of Chinese workers in Pakistan, knowing that in the long term, 10, 20, 30 years from now, China will have a much stronger position economically and politically in Pakistan, which is a key node of the BRI because it will allow China to bypass the Straits of Malacca near Singapore and access the Indian Ocean that way. So I think this is an opportune time. Crisis can be viewed as opportunity, and Chinese leaders are very intelligent when it comes to dealing with moments of opportunity.
Yeah, so trying to build these various bridges. Now, another person raised the question of, so a couple of people have talked about COVID-19 and those kinds of, and related topics. But they've mentioned, you highlighted a digital Silk Road and things like that. And Agnes Lin, I think, asked about a health Silk Road or health and BRI. Because some people have been asking about that too, about the kind of human capital development that might also be an asset that China can use in dealing with countries.
Well, certainly China has a recent history of being ground zero for all types of viruses that have passed from wildlife to humans. So when we in the United States look at the news of Chinese people wearing masks 2 or 3 years ago, we may have said, oh, that's hard for us to understand. But China's had a recent history of understanding what it means for citizens to react to and protect themselves from these type of pandemics. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Also, the fact that China's economy operates on such a large scale means that pharmaceutical companies, companies that manufacture masks, companies that manufacture products for the healthcare industry can quickly deploy and produce goods that are needed in terms of global health and can export them. China has a very well-developed port and export system. So all of these factors that before were viewed as just China connecting to the global economy for the purpose of becoming wealthy can also be translated into China becoming an important exporter of health products. And that's one other point. And then finally, I'd like to say that, of course, traditional Chinese medicine is something that has characterized healing processes in China and beyond China for thousands of years. So perhaps looking forward, perhaps uses of agriculture and herbs will be, which are very common in Chinese traditional medicine, will be exported more to BRI participant countries. So there's no reason to think that just because economics and infrastructure and building is what we think about often when we think about the BRI today, there's no reason to think that ideas, cultures, norms, medicine will not follow as well.
Yeah, that's the direction I wanted to go with that particular question, because China historically has provided training for physicians, for engineers from African countries, from Southeast Asia, from other places, and that is an important potential resource, especially if it's tied together with having people in place in Ethiopia, in any number of places, who can then work side by side with the Chinese engineers on these various developments. And so that sort of thing seemed like an important aspect. Now, at the same time that, just by chance, we happen to be talking today, but there's been a lot in the news of late about tensions between African Americans and Africans in China, especially Africans in China, with how they are being treated both officially and by their neighbors. And that raises a question, because so many Chinese are going abroad and are being, they have mixed experiences in Angola and Mozambique, in any number of places, but how welcoming can China be within? Okay, it's one thing to go and sign the contracts and to have opening ceremonies, but how about the interpersonal connections as well as the official policies?
Well, from the point of view of interpersonal connections, I think it's fair to say that Chinese people, like all people, are individuals. They can be different, and not all Chinese people are the same, obviously. In terms of policy, I think that because China has such a large population with so many complex problems and issues facing Chinese society, understandably, Chinese leaders need to focus on the problems that Chinese citizens raise. So protecting African citizens who happen to be in China, I'm not sure if that necessarily is at the top of Chinese leaders' priorities. But of course, PR, public relations, is very important for China. So maintaining peaceful relations between different ethnicities within China is something that Chinese leaders, I would imagine, care about very much, especially as the BRI becomes more and more well known. China is being looked at by the whole world. People are focusing on China, and what happens in China will also eventually get on the news, and people will notice, and people are noticing if different ethnicities are not being treated well. This is why the fact that the Uyghurs in Xinjiang are being put in these camps, this is something that's not only a domestic issue now, this is an international issue. When we think of Tibet, Tibet is no longer a domestic issue only. Tibet is international as well. Hong Kong, as we've seen in the last year, is technically under the control of Beijing, but it's very much an international issue. So all these domestic issues, which perhaps technically fall within the territorial boundaries of People's Republic of China, have become international. So what we see in China is not only bounded to a Chinese type response.
Well, and that's also this question, it impinges on this question of sovereignty, right, and responsibility. Are you a citizen of the world or just a citizen of a particular country? What sorts of norms? Who enforces these norms comes to play. And that's your comments about Xinjiang, Tibet. That's sort of where I was going when I asked about the domestic political imperative of trying to develop that region so as to more fully integrate it within China. That's part of that initiative. But the point is not just that what happens in China is now of international attention, but how you treat Africans in Guangzhou or elsewhere becomes a domestic political issue for those African countries. And that's what led to pressure that resulted in a number of African ambassadors linking up to issue a protest to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And so where else, what other points of friction do you see? Because again, when you're going abroad, you may just want to go and build a bridge, but the person who invites you to build that bridge is involved in a political network. And that's part of the story in Sri Lanka, right? They signed an agreement with a particular president to deliver a particular port at a particular time, and it wasn't commercially feasible. But how can China avoid having to deal with the messiness of the places where it goes? Any place has politics, any place has factions, and there are winners and losers. Who's winning when China comes in? Who's losing?
Well, one of the places where it's hardest for China to succeed has been in these Central Asian states, so countries like Kazakhstan. Part of the reason is that Kazakhstan and other the Central Asian countries have had a legacy of being under the Soviet umbrella, and are striving now for the first time to really develop and become independent countries. And they're struggling with dealing with this large neighbor, China, which is offering incentives, political and economic, to join up with this growing power. And so Central Asia has been a place where we've seen tensions. The idea of this land port on the border of Kazakhstan and China, Korgos, has on the one hand been touted as a political and economic boon for both countries, but in reality, there have been a lot of tensions between the Kazakhs and the Chinese who have not seen eye to eye, who do not personally get along with each other. I think a broad answer to this, Clay, would be those people who choose to learn the other country's culture and language specifically tend to get on better with Chinese project leaders. So many people who speak Chinese, they tend to be viewed by Chinese people in a more favorable light than if they don't speak Chinese, or excuse me, Mandarin. So I think it's a cultural challenge. China's historical views of its place in the world, as I've mentioned several times, have the vision of China being a helper and benevolent to others, but also implying that China has more power. So these power dynamics are hard to erase, even with loans, even with conferences.
Well, and exactly. So you have China is large, it's prosperous compared to many of the places that it's going, and the terms of engagement aren't always equal and aren't always equally beneficial. At the same token, these kinds of things can foster development, can encourage encourage economic activity in the target country, and that benefits the people there as well as tying them perhaps to China. Tom, you have done a wonderful job addressing a very complex subject and very much a moving target, right? Trying to document and describe this thing that we're calling the Belt and Road Initiative. What, and this will be the last question, what should we look for next? Is there a timeline for sorting some of these things out? Is there a threshold at which China will need to have some sort of association, or where the countries that are partners on the BRI are going to say, we're going to form a BRI association in the same way that McDonald's franchisees form an association to better deal with the home office, that sort of thing. What do you see in the medium and long term?
I think in the medium term, we know that many countries are suffering economically. So in the medium to short to medium term, I anticipate countries wanting to continue to deepen their relationship with China, not just economically, but politically. Political relations can improve understanding, communication, exchange. So I expect hopefully once this pandemic passes, I expect people to continue to learn and work with Chinese authorities. But I also expect Chinese businesses, Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are some of the largest corporations in the world, to continue to expand beyond China's borders and to maybe reach out to countries that have not yet agreed to participate as BRI members. So I think there's always going to be a weariness, though, on the part of the United States and on the part of European countries to try to understand the direction that China will take in terms of sovereignty. And I think focusing what we should do as observers, of people who care about politics and global citizens, we should try to understand the BRI, not just from a physical infrastructure point of view, but try to understand what type of power dynamics and ideas are being offered, and how can those ideas mesh with, or how do those ideas relate to the way that we view the world. So this is a very challenging project.
And isn't the principal difficulty is that many of us approach this from a zero-sum mentality, that something that helps China with its own economy and with its relations with others comes at American or European expense. Are we wrong to think that?
Well, absolutely. I think the Chinese would be the first to say that they benefited from the Western model of trade, free trade. And so I think, as I mentioned earlier, GE, one of the most, or used to be one of the most successful American companies, has benefited from winning millions of dollars of contracts from the Chinese-led BRI. So I think this idea of zero sum is antiquated. It doesn't have to be that way. I think we do have to be careful in terms of what our goals are as a country, as people, but there's no reason why actors in China and actors in the United States cannot both benefit from working with each other and expanding into new markets.
Tom, thank you so much for sharing this research with us. You've been working in this field for quite some time. You and I have known each other for a couple decades, meeting at our respective alma mater at UCLA. It is a great pleasure to bring you to this Zoom microphone. Next time, we hope that you can be at USC and we can have you with a USC audience in the flesh, as it were. And one of the things that we intend to do when you come is to make sure we get you a US-China Institute mug as a gesture of our appreciation. So thank you so much. And thanks to all the people who made this happen. Carol Wise, the staff at the USC US-China Institute. Thanks especially to the better than 100 people who have chosen to share with us this time and to have a chance to focus on this important initiative. Thanks for joining us. Tom, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.